Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us virtually, everyone. My name is Ben Cahill. I'm a senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change program at CSIS. And I'm really pleased to welcome today a special guest, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is the UK Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Hope I got the title right.
Absolutely.
Really pleased to have you here today.
Great to be here, Ben.
And we're here at a very challenging time for energy ministers. We are coming from a couple months of very elevated gas prices, electricity prices, oil prices, diesel prices across the world. So it's a tough time for energy ministers in continental Europe in particular, but also the UK and the US. A lot of turbulence in commodity markets, and obviously inflation and price increases are a big challenge for both of our countries.
Sure.
But it's also a pivotal time for climate policy. Of course, Glasgow hosted the COP26 conference last November. The UK introduced its updated, expanded net zero strategy. I'm sure we'll talk in some detail about that. But there is the sense that we're responding to an acute short-term energy security challenge, and we have to do this without losing sight of the longer-term climate challenges that we all face. So there's a lot to talk about today.
Sure.
Really grateful to have you here. You're here in Washington for a strategic energy dialogue, which you held yesterday with your counterpart, Jennifer Granholm, at the U.S. Department of Energy. I wonder if you could just start by giving us a readout of that dialogue and some of the key points of discussion.
I think it was a great opportunity for me to see Jennifer again. I've met her a number of times, and I think Secretary Granholm and her team are really focused on many of the problems, as you've outlined, that we are. Clearly, energy prices are a huge issue, but her focus also is on the longer term challenge in terms of getting carbon emissions down from the economy. And we feel absolutely that we can do both. We can grow our economy while at the same time reduce our carbon emissions. And we've done that, I think, quite successfully in the UK. So if you look at 1990 to now, to 2020, we managed to reduce our carbon emissions by 45%, 44% actually, while growing the economy by 78%. So that shows that you can, as an economy, reduce carbon emissions and also grow the pie, as it were, create more prosperity, more jobs. And Jennifer Granholm, as you know, she was governor of Michigan, so she knows all about industrial communities that have gone through essentially deindustrialized processes, and she knows that the only way we can get our people behind reducing carbon emissions is by linking it to jobs, to prosperity. And in that we talked about offshore wind, we also talked about nuclear, civil nuclear power, and also we've talked about the immediate challenges posed by Russian aggression in Ukraine.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit and talk about some of the discussion points around nuclear energy. So the UK introduced a new nuclear policy, as I understand it, back in April, including a plan to build out some new reactors. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the UK plans are for nuclear energy, how you see that fitting in with your longer-term decarbonization agenda, and what you talked about here in the US.
So I'll just say a couple of things about nuclear. I mean, the reason why there's a renewed focus on nuclear is that if you're committed to net zero, as we are by law, you have to figure out how you can get decarbonized power on a cheap and continuous basis. And anyone can see that the issue with renewables is that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So you've got a problem there in terms of how you can get firm power, dispatchable power, immediate power, whatever phrase you want to use. You need something that is continuous, that you can rely on. And as far as the UK is concerned, as far as the government is concerned, the UK government is concerned, nuclear is really the only answer to that conundrum. It's the only source of continuous power that is not carbon emitting. It has its own challenges, but once you realize that you need that base load, decarbonized base load, nuclear is the answer. And we've had a very mixed history in the UK with nuclear. We had the first civil nuclear plant, I think it was in 1957, in the north of the country. We rolled out nuclear power, civil nuclear power in the 60s and in the 70s largely. but we managed to discover North Sea oil and gas. And that essentially was, I think, largely responsible for, because we had cheap sources of energy, largely responsible for the lack of drive, the lack of push in the nuclear space. So it was a technology that we were very good at, but now other countries have got very good at it as well. And the US is one of them. The US is one of the countries, a handful, that engage with civil nuclear. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. That's to find out how we can work together. And you were very kind enough to refer to our strategy, the British energy security strategy. And in that we, as you say, are committed to 24 gigawatts of nuclear power, which is a very ambitious target, and shows how serious we are to driving that technology. And that's the 24 gigawatts by 2050 target.
Right. And I know another big topic on the agenda in this dialogue between the UK and the US is about responding to the current crisis in commodity markets. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you're dealing with these challenges in the UK with these extremely elevated prices, and from a policy perspective, how the UK has responded and what parallels you see between the UK and US challenges in this regard.
So I think that the challenge, I mean, you've got to remember where we've come from. So there were two big issues in the last couple of years. Obviously, we had the COVID pandemic, and governments from across the world responded in an extraordinary way, a way we haven't seen before, where there were lockdowns right across economies in the world. It was a worldwide thing. And then, of course, as particularly Asia came out of lockdown, there was a huge spike in demand, and it was quite immediate demand. I mean, you could see that reflected in very high gas prices. I've just spoken to a whole bunch of LNG producers and LNG traders in the US. And they described to me how the demand coming out of Asia, beginning of last year, middle of last year, was enormous. So that forced prices up, that demand. And then you compound that with Russian aggression in Ukraine, Russian invasion, February the 24th. And you've got very, very high prices. And in order to deal with that, we've got a thing called a retail price cap in the UK, which protects consumers from very high gas prices. The Chancellor, Treasurer, has also made remarks and interventions saying that he's going to help people. We've got 9 billion of interventions earlier this year. He's made very strong remarks saying that there could well be further intervention to help people through that difficulty, and the Prime Minister as well is committed to that. So in the short term, we think we can try and support people bear some of the burden of it, alleviate the burden. But in the medium term, we were very focused on getting a strategy which meant that we could have security of supply, and that's why things like nuclear power, offshore wind have been a real focus of the strategy, and that gives us more medium-term protection.
Yeah. Well, the entire European Union is facing a big challenge now in responding to the needs of the moment while sticking to this very ambitious transition agenda. And one of the interesting things sitting in Washington and watching this process is that it seems like the policy momentum to shift to renewable energy, if anything, has only strengthened as a result of this. But there are big challenges. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the UK is working with the EU27 on its transition agenda, how what they're doing is affecting your plans, how you can assist in this process.
So we've worked very closely with European colleagues, not only on a bilateral basis, but also with the EU as a whole. So Kadri Simpson, who's the EU Commissioner for Energy, is someone I speak to regularly. And we're all facing the same problems. We're facing higher input costs, higher energy costs. We're also committed very seriously to decarbonization. And so there are various ways in which fora in which we engage with EU counterparts, the International Energy Agency in Paris, G7, 3 of the countries are associated with Europe. We've got other forums as well. So we're very, very engaged with what they're trying to do. We're very interested in developing new technologies like offshore wind. There's a particular interest in hydrogen, where we can develop both blue and green hydrogen, electrolyzer-produced hydrogen. The EU is very committed to the green hydrogen, electrolyzer-produced, but also recognizes the need to have blue hydrogen to get the hydrogen economy going. So there's a whole range of things we're talking about in terms of new technologies. We're also sharing our experience getting off coal. 10 years ago we had 40% of electricity generation from burning coal, essentially. Today in the UK that's 2%. In Europe they also want to shift away from burning coal because they realize how damaging that can be in terms of carbon emissions. And that's again another area where we cooperate quite closely through dialogue, through shared ideas, and a commitment. We're also in this North Sea, the North Sea basin. Also I speak directly to Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian counterparts to think about offshore wind, how we can coordinate some of our plans, and how we can essentially be custodians of the North Sea. So there's a whole range of technologies that we speak to the EU on. I wouldn't believe everything you read about our relationship with the EU. I think it's quite a healthy one, certainly in the energy space.
Yeah. So you've touched on a couple different technology areas. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper on each of them. Talk to us a little bit about hydrogen and what the UK strategy is for developing hydrogen, where you might want to center some of those early phase projects or pilot projects to help provide jobs and kind of target investment and economic activity. What's the potential there?
I think there's huge potential in hydrogen, largely because if we look at natural gas, hydrogen can be reformed. If you reform natural gas, you can get hydrogen, blue hydrogen, quite easily. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests that hydrogen can do for you the sort of types of things that natural gas can, except that it doesn't have the carbon content. As far as we're concerned in terms of the geographies, we've got carbon capture, which of course is the flip side of blue hydrogen production. And we've already got 2 sites where we want to promote carbon capture usage and storage. And those 2 sites are in the northeast, Teesside, Humber sort of area, for those of you who know the UK, and in the northwest, sort of North Wales, Merseyside, and the area around Liverpool. And in those 2 sites, we've got really impressive projects, which we hope to see can develop carbon capture. And then, of course, on the back of carbon capture, you've got blue hydrogen production. And that's where I think we're slightly different in our approach from EU colleagues. In the EU, their focus is very much on, as I said, electrolyzer-produced hydrogen, green hydrogen. Right. We've adopted very deliberately what I call a twin-track approach, which is blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. In fact, I called it that when I was the energy minister. That was my contribution, I suppose, to the strategy, one of them. So we think we can do both, and the intuition behind that is that for now, blue hydrogen production is a lot cheaper than green hydrogen production. So you're not going to be able to produce hydrogen at scale very cheaply with green hydrogen. So you've got to start off with the cheaper product, if you like. And that, in our context, has got a very low carbon content. And we think we know it is clean, but we realize that that's the quickest way to getting a hydrogen economy and getting enough scale of production, which can incentivize investment in electrolyzers and green hydrogen. And that's a strategy which I think has more or less been endorsed by counterparts in the EU, because I certainly know that counterparts in Germany are very interested in the first instance importing hydrogen. They're already in the market for deals in terms of importing blue hydrogen to get the hydrogen economy going. And that's a very exciting prospect. And I think in the next 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to see a real change, a real step forward in this. Yeah.
A lot of countries in Europe are gas short, so they don't have the resources available to do blue hydrogen, especially in the early stages.
Well, they're short of methane, and they're also short of the sites where they can do the carbon capture, which you need to produce blue hydrogen. So in terms of the assets they have, the infrastructure, that's something that we see we can help them in terms of manufacturing blue hydrogen and then maybe exporting it.
Yeah. You mentioned offshore wind. I wonder if you could share a little bit of the UK experience in building an offshore wind sector. I mean, obviously, this is a huge area of focus for the Biden administration.
Sure.
The US is a little bit late to the game in terms of offshore wind. One of the challenges that we face here is rapid deployment, trying to get this done as soon as possible for climate reasons, while still trying to make sure that people and companies in America benefit from this new industry, because it will be an area that has huge potential. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the UK experience with offshore wind and what potential you see there, what the economic impact is of the industry in your experience over time.
So offshore wind, I mean, I've mentioned the fact that we had 40% of our electricity coming from coal burning in 2010, and today that's 2%. And the sharp reduction in that has been really helped by offshore wind and electricity production through offshore wind. And that's something that's come from really nothing in 2010 to 11 gigawatts of installed capacity. I mean, that's a huge amount. By contrast, I've just come literally from the Department of the Interior, and the official there said to me that I think you've got installed in the US, the whole of the US, it was something like 43 megawatts. It was something in that order. That might not be the exact number, but it was something.
That's in the ballpark.
So that's in the ballpark, as they say. That's one of my favorite baseball expressions. And actually, what we've done is we've managed to really grow and attract capital, attract investment in offshore wind, which has allowed us to drive this renewable technology. And as far as I'm concerned, we're only at the beginning. We've got a 50 gigawatt target for 2030, which is 5 times nearly what we have now. There's plenty of capacity in the pipeline, and we're very focused on getting that up and ready. I think in the US, you're starting from pretty much from scratch, but that's very exciting. That means that you can develop very, very quickly. And there's a real commitment from the administration, from officials and the cabinet ministers in the Biden government to do that. There seems to be a real push. And they understand as well, and you mentioned this, that the only way that we're going to get real buy-in from communities is through jobs, through wealth creation and investment. And I think that's a very attractive prospect.
I appreciate you outlining these longer-term priorities, and it's great to hear your perspective on them. I wonder if you could now talk a little bit about some of the short-term pressures of the day with high energy prices.
Yeah.
There are no easy solutions, obviously, to elevated gasoline or petrol prices.
Sure.
But what is the UK government doing about this? What are the policy responses you're putting in place? And what do you think is the threat to economic growth and activity as a result of these high prices?
I think it's a really great question. I mean, it's an immediate issue that's global. All around the world, governments are trying to deal with increasing prices, inflation, higher energy bills. And the way we're dealing with this in the short term is by providing support. We have council tax in the UK, but we're giving a rebate to council tax, particularly for vulnerable, for consumers with fewer resources, frankly, lower incomes. And we're making direct intervention in that way. We're giving money. We've got a thing called the Warm Homes Discount, which is for people who are vulnerable, who have low incomes. And we're supporting them through the bills, essentially through spending money, which is a reasonable thing to do. In the medium term, as I said, we've got a security strategy that is going to ensure that we have energy independence, that we can produce the energy we need in the UK. And that's also largely going to be not carbon emitting through new technologies. That takes a bit more time, but that's the two things that we're doing. Short term, fiscal intervention. Medium term, we're developing new technologies really to bolster resilience and create energy independence.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the oil and gas industry and the North Sea in particular.
Sure.
There's a lot of dialogue here in Washington about balancing this need for short-term energy supplies, which really means fossil fuels in the short term, but making sure that we don't lose sight of the policies we need to put in place to reduce oil demand over the medium to long term. So the UK North Sea is still a pretty significant producing basin. It's declining, it's mature, but there's a lot of economic value still left.
Yeah.
I know that there are a lot of people who believe that we should stop all leasing in the future. And the government has been criticized for approving new projects. So talk us through how you are thinking about the need for maybe short-term investment now and approving new offshore projects versus the longer-term trajectory of moving away from oil and gas.
So the key word in this is transition. So what we're saying is we're saying that we're going to use gas as part of the transition to net zero. I think the idea that we could somehow, pull all the licensing rounds and effectively just switch the lights off on the industry overnight, I think that was not realistic at all. you've got to remember that there are 250,000 people roughly who have jobs in the UK working in the oil and gas sector. And so it wasn't realistic simply to switch the lights off on that industry overnight, as I said. However, we think that any ongoing support or encouragement for the industry has to be matched by an industry commitment to decarbonize through the electrification of platforms and reducing emissions in the process of extracting this source of power. And I think generally the industry's moved a long way in the last 2 years in recognizing that that has to happen. They're not going to enjoy the sort of support from anyone really if they're not committed to carbon emissions reductions. And even in as far as their own interests are concerned, I mean, people's oil and gas executives say to me that they find it very difficult with recruits, with graduates, attracting them into their businesses if they don't have credible decarbonization offer. And that's why I think we have to work with the industry. And we've talked also about new technologies. We've talked about hydrogen, we've talked about carbon capture, we've talked about offshore wind as well. And in nearly all of those technologies, you've got the traditional companies such as BP, Shell, others, investing in the new technologies. So there's a classic case of companies evolving, and I think they are in the process of doing that. And that's why we want to encourage companies to do that. And I was speaking to climate change activists in my constituency, just outside London, and even very, very keen green activists are saying, well, we've got to work with the companies. We can't just force them against their will to change their behavior, because they have huge amounts of capital, they have huge amounts of expertise. And why wouldn't we work with them to affect net zero as opposed to fighting them?
Yeah. This brings me to another question, which is about a just transition. This is an issue that we work on quite a lot in our program at CSIS. So there is a big question amid this transition away from fossil fuels over the long term about what happens to fossil fuel communities and regions and workers. And part of this is an industrial policy question, which is in your job title. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about the economic potential of these new areas, like offshore wind, and what policies the UK is putting in place to target investment into those areas that were former heartlands of the oil and gas industry or other heavy industry. Talk to us a little bit about how you're thinking about aligning kind of the near-term investments with this longer-term challenge of providing jobs and revenue and a future for these regions.
I think that's a great question. And I can't talk so much about the US. I mean, my US geography is a little hazy, so bear with me.
Probably better than my UK geography.
But I think that there's a huge opportunity here, because precisely in those areas where there was an industrial past, those are the opportunities that we see in terms of reindustrialization, in terms of driving the green industrial revolution. So an example of this is in the northeast. The northeast of England, particularly, was a real hub of industrial activity. There was shipbuilding, there was coal mining, there was steel production, at a pretty substantial scale. Over the last few decades, a lot of that industrial activity has been curtailed, and there are communities who want jobs, but they've got that industrial passion, they've got that creativity, they've got that tradition in manufacturing. And what's happening, even just before our eyes, is that we're investing in green technology. So if you look at Teesside, there's going to be carbon capture there. There is manufacturing of monopiles and wind turbines for offshore wind. There's electrolyzer manufacturing in the Humber area. And all of these places, which were real hives of industrial activity, are now buzzing again, if I may use that metaphor, with green industrial technologies, manufacturing and skills. So there's quite a match, I think, between the old industrial base that the UK had and these new industries. Now, it's going to take time. I'm not saying every single place where we had the old industrial revolution is going to be a green industry hub. But there's a real fit to that. And I see it also in the US. I mean, I've had conversations with TerraPower. They were founded essentially by Bill Gates and others. But they look at nuclear power. But they've got a site near a very old coal mine in Wyoming. I just learned about that a few days ago. And they are very conscious of the fact that they want to use the expertise, use the infrastructure for other purposes. So I think there's a huge opportunity in the United States as well for repurposing some of that old industrial legacy to new technologies. One of the things that Secretary Granholm mentioned was geothermal. Now, geothermal can work very well in old oil or coal assets because there's the wells, there's been drilling, and the assets are there waiting to be repurposed. So I think there's a real opportunity here for jobs, industrial jobs, manufacturing jobs, well-paid jobs in precisely the areas you talk about.
Yeah. I think one of the questions coming out of COP26 was how all these decarbonization pledges and the momentum on climate policy will be carried forward and put into practical terms. What's next? So I wonder if you could speak broadly about some of the alignment you see between industry and government.
Sure.
Getting the investment in place and the early stage pilot projects and things like that to actually make those pledges at COP26 become a reality, and especially in some of these areas you talk about.
I think it's very positive development. I mean, if you look at where we were at COP26, COP26 was really the first COP, and then people said to me, and these are people who've been to 15, 20 COPs even. John Kerry made the point. It was the first COP where you had industry, you had business. I mean, generally the COP conferences were with politicians, lobbyists, the usual policy crowd. Whereas in Glasgow last year, that was the first time that companies, corporates, really engaged with this issue. And I think that was a remarkable thing. And if you also look at the kind of conversations, how we structured the conversation around decarbonisation, it was the first time that we actually talked about sectors. We talked about cars, we talked about agriculture, we talked about other areas, industry, other areas, in a sector by sector way, how we could decarbonise. And that was those two reasons, the private sector engagement and the sector approach, were two ways in which the COP26 was, I think, groundbreaking. I think there's been a lot of momentum behind it. It's been checked a little bit, perhaps, by what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia, and the war there, the terrible war there. But I think there's a real willingness on the part of business to work together with government. And so we've got the finance pledge, the $100 billion from Copenhagen, which was in 2009. That was finally agreed at COP last year. We've got a whole bunch of initiatives where we're looking at working with the private sector, working with companies like Amazon, to preserve the Amazon. No pun intended. I think that was their idea. Yeah. But we're working together across different countries and different companies to solve these problems, because we realise, as I said, that there's no way that government on its own can do this. There's no way that the private sector on its own can do it either.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few minutes left. I have one final question for you. You're here in Washington talking to mostly an American audience. There may be some people who've dialed in from the UK or elsewhere. But you're from the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk about climate policy from a Conservative Party perspective. I mean, what are the areas of common ground when it comes to climate between the major parties in the UK? And what are some of the differences you see between that and the American system?
So in the UK system, what I would say is that there is a degree of consensus around the net zero challenge. I think where there is a massive difference is the approach. The Conservative Party takes, I think, a business-led approach, and we realise deeply in our bones, as it were, there's no way the government can spend itself to net zero. It has to work with the private sector. It has to work with people who can mobilise far greater assets than the government can. And that's individual businesses, that's funds, that's investors, that's banks. I think until recently, I don't know what the Labour approach is now, but until recently, they essentially, the John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, led Labour Party, thought we could essentially nationalise all these assets. So I remember having a debate with John McDonnell, and he was saying we were going to have 51%, the government was going to own 51% of the offshore wind farms. And I was thinking, why would I own 49% if they own 51%? What incentive is there for me to invest? in assets which are 51% state-owned. Anyway, so that's a very different approach, I would suggest. I think Labour may be evolving. I don't quite know where they stand on that. Sometimes they're saying they want to nationalise the energy companies, and other times they don't. In the US, I think it's a more polarised debate, from what I've seen. I mean, I'm not an expert on US politics, but certainly I have a lot of dealings with the administration. So when President Trump was in the White House, I dealt with his cabinet ministers, his administration, and now I'm dealing with President Biden. So there's a difference of approach. Clearly, I think there's more interest in multilateral engagement. But at the same time, what's going on and this is a great thing about the United States, there's a lot of decarbonisation, but it's all done through state policy. The states are really driving a lot of the reform here. And that to me is very interesting. You know, you look at what different states are doing with renewables, with incentivizing carbon capture. You have different states have different policies on fracking. It's very much done at the state level, and I think a lot of decarbonisation, interesting and purposeful decarbonisation happens at that level. But the national debate, I agree, is a little bit more polarised. Although I would say it's less polarised than it was 5 years ago when I was here last.
Yeah. Well, the current climate with energy and climate challenges is concentrating minds a little bit, so hopefully we'll have a bit more potential for collaboration.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. Secretary Kwarteng, you've been extremely generous with your time. Thank you so much for being with us. And everyone who's dialed in from our online audience, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.